Today is Tuesday, June 8th, 2010. My name is Frieda Reitman, and it's my pleasure to interview today Ruth Kwartin at her home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Archive of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. I have been looking forward to this day. As someone born in Stamford, let's start with your birth family background, when and why your parents came to Stamford.
My parents came to Stamford after they were married. My mother was from New Haven, my father was from Bridgeport. I think they moved to Stamford so they weren't next to their immediate relatives. They first lived in an apartment, and when my sister was born, they started looking for a house and eventually moved to Woodmere Road here in Stamford. And they lived there all of my unmarried life, let's put it that way. My father was very interested in Jewish education, and he was a member of Temple. They were members of Temple Bethel, very active. My mother in the sisterhood. My father eventually was head of the education committee, and it was through his working with the temple that they added schoolrooms to the old Bethel. And after my father's death and my mother's also, my sister and I had opened up a library at Temple Bethel in their names. First it was the Max Miller Library, now it's the Max and Mildred Miller Library, which is still in existence at Temple Bethel. So they went to services most Friday nights, because in those days a conservative temple didn't have Saturday morning services. So I can remember being in the choir there under duress, I must admit, because I have no singing voice. But this was something that Mom wanted us to do, and so we did it. I was also confirmed at Temple Bethel, and one of the picture is there at the Bethel.
Who was the cantor and who was the rabbi?
There was no cantor in those days. We had Rabbi Perlman, David Perlman, who was the rabbi through my childhood and married me also, and we had an organist. And that was David Rabinowitz, who was my piano teacher. So we had an organ in that temple, and this was the old temple on Prospect Street, which has been torn down now. And then that's pretty much the basics of my parents.
Some childhood memories you want to record in general, or?
Well, I lived in a street that had no girls that were my age. There were only 3 boys that were my age. So I grew up running with the boys. And they were, we used to fight and we used to play cowboys and Indians. We had Woodside Park, which is now called Scalzi Park, behind my parents' house, and also Grace and Brown's house, and also the Levine house. 3 of us lived on the same side, and then Leslie Soloff lived on the other side of Woodmere Road. So the 4 of us would get together and do fighting and stuff like that, running around, play ball, whatever.
Were they all Jewish?
Yes, they were.
So you lived on a street with a
lot of Jews, but I would say the 4 families were the only Jews on that block. Okay. Next door to us were 2 Irish women that were, I think, teachers. Mrs. Vuno, who was well known in Stamford, lived next door to them, and it wasn't it just so happened that there were 4 Jewish families. I do know, because of what my mother told me, that when they were looking for a house in Stamford, they had found a house they liked in Hubbard Heights. And because their name was Miller, they didn't realize that they were Jewish. And finally, the fact came out that my parents were Jewish, and they were told they couldn't buy there. Okay. So that is my first memory of
Anti-Semitism.
A type of anti-Semitism, yes. I myself witnessed very little of it. Maybe I was just unaware. The only time I can recall, as I was telling you, somebody called my sister, my older sister, a dirty Jew one day at Hart School where I went, or we went, and I picked up a stone and threw it at him. And I got called up in front of the principal for that. I think I was maybe 7. And after that, nobody ever said anything against either one of us that I can recall.
Okay.
Growing up in Stanford, while I had these Jewish boys, once I found a girl my age that I could relate to. I dropped those kids, and that was Ingeborg Bloss. Her parents were European refugees. Both were psychiatrists or psychiatrists. And she lived up on Hubbard Avenue, and she was my first dearest best friend, girlfriend that I had. Though all my friends in school were a mixed bag. We were all, there were black kids, there were Italians, they were Polish, they were everything. My first boyfriend that I really loved was a black kid in Hart School, and hey, I was, first grade or something like that, but that was it.
Tell us some more about your education,
Well,
high school and beyond.
Hart School was the district school. We used to walk to school or be driven, depending upon weather and age. And I can remember when I was very young, we used to walk home for lunch and then walk back to the school. And it was, or get driven by mom, depending upon the years. And we used to walk through Woodside Park, which was open. It was probably a mile or so, but it was, kids don't think anything about that at that time.
At that time.
Yeah, my mother used to walk from Woodmere Road down to where the railroad station is now, because the best and cheapest supermarket was there. And she used to walk me in my pram, my baby carriage. She used to tell me about it. She liked to walk. Maybe that's why she lived to 90.
Okay.
And probably at that time, maybe we only had one car in the family.
And you went to high school?
I went to junior high school, which was Burdick, which is no longer, and then Stanford High School. Most of my friends were not Jewish. They were a mixed bag of kids, mostly kids from my classes. The classes were divided by, they were ranked classes. So if you were college bound, you would be in the one class. If you were going to secretarial, you'll be in 2. If you were going technical, you'd either go to Right Tech or be in a different grouping. So all your classes would be with the same kids, and you would become friends with them. And I had about 40 friends in that grouping. I had a wonderful experience in high school. After the war, in 1950, Stanford started an exchange program with European students. And they brought over a German girl and a German boy to go to Stanford High School. And the girl and I became best friends forever. She survived the war in Berlin. She told me that when the Russians came into Berlin, her father actually put her in the oven to hide her. She and I just got along right from the get-go. And we kept in touch for years and years and visited each other and families. She eventually moved to the United States permanently. And recently I emailed her daughter, because I had lost touch with my friend Eva and found out that she had died. And that's why I hadn't heard from her in a while. So I can remember one time I took her to services with me and my family because we went every Friday night. And that time, Rabbi Perlman was giving a big talk on the Holocaust. And I was saying to myself, oh my gosh, you know, this is going to be painful. Well, Eva wept through that sermon. She told me about what it was like to have Jewish friends and have them disappear or leave, and asking around, where is Rebecca, where's somebody, and being told, they're gone, don't ask again. And being frightened as a child by this, because remember, when the war ended, we were 11. Mm-hmm. You know, when the...
And how old was she when she came over?
Well, she was probably a year older than I was. So I was 16, maybe she was 17.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's a few years later.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you go off to school after that?
After that, I went to Skidmore College, where once again, my closest friends turned out to be not Jewish, though I had Jewish friends too, but the ones that I've kept in touch with and I go visit or see are basically not Jewish kids. I don't know why. I went out with different guys. It was a girls' school, and there would be different college weekends where you'd go off to one place or the other and meet guys. Eventually, I was lucky enough to meet my husband, though.
Okay.
And that was here in Stamford.
So tell us a little about that and the family that you two created.
Well, Saul was actually came to Stamford to work as a lawyer, and while I was still in high school. He was 7 years my senior. At that time, my mother knew of him and met him because he was working for Wofsy, Rosen, Kweskin, and Kuryansky, and that was the law firm that my parents used. Plus, my mother was best friends with Rose Rosen, Dave Rosen's wife. And she said, oh, you got a nice-looking guy there. Let's see if we can fix him up with Grace. Now, Grace is my sister, my older sister. Well, Rose had to tell her that Saul was engaged, which he was, and so that never happened. By the time I met him, he was no longer engaged, obviously, and it was about 3 or 4 years later that I met him. They had Skidmore used to have father-daughter weekends up at where the fathers would come and spend the weekend, and we'd have all sorts of things. And they had a picture in the Advocate of the local Stamford girls with their fathers, or Norwalk, or just this local. And Saul saw my picture. This is one of the myths that I tell everybody. And he decided he knew who I was because he recognized my father. And he called me up one day and asked me if I would go out with him, and I said no. I said, well, I'm going to Europe in 2 days, and why don't you call me when I get back? And he said no. He said, as I was hanging up the phone, he told me he had gone to Dartmouth. My phone was halfway down. He came from Brooklyn. It was almost all the way down. And then he asked me out for dinner, and I said yes. So we went. Anybody who asked me out for dinner would get a date.
Okay.
So we went out for dinner, and he took me out to a restaurant, which little did he know, my father had an interest in. It was Cobb's Mill Inn. At that point, my father loved to get involved with things like restaurants or Broadway shows and invest in them. I have a son just like that, my older one. Anyhow, we had a nice date, and I came home and told my mother that this was exactly the sort of man I would like to marry eventually. And I said, bye, I'm off to Europe for 3 months. Well, when I came home, Saul was practically sitting on the doorstep waiting for me. he had fallen in love with me on that first date. And what I had felt towards him as being the type of person I would like to marry, because he was wonderful. He was a wonderful person, and it just came out of him. He found something in me that matched what he was looking for. Anyhow, we had 5 dates. He proposed to me. I said no. And I said, I don't know you well enough after 5 dates and over 6 months, because when I came home from Europe, I had a week, and then I went back to college. So our dates were few and far between. But he called me, he wrote to me, and he came up to visit me, and eventually I said yes, which I had intended to all along. I just didn't feel as if I knew him well enough, though, to say yes at that point. I was 20.
Okay. Were you married in Stanford?
Yes, we got married at Temple Bethel. Rabbi Perlman, once again, was our rabbi and married us. Saul's uncle. Saul came from a fairly famous family. His father was a very famous cantor, Ruth Kwartin. He had 2 marriages, as did his mother, and both times they were widowed. And when Saul was born, his father was 56, and his mother was in her late 30s. And so it was like having your grandfather. But Saul loved his father, and his father loved him, and they had a terrific relationship. I have a movie of my husband's bar mitzvah, or after his bar mitzvah, which was up in the Catskills where they spent the summer. And after the bar mitzvah, there's my husband riding a goat. I love this. We just laugh all the time. But the best part of this little film, and it only lasts about 5 minutes, is Saul embracing his father with such love. And it was a wonderful experience for both of them. They each got a lot out of it. According to one of my brother-in-laws of his father's older family, when they were growing up, the first 4 children of Ruth Kwartin, he was ambitious. He was traveling a lot, becoming famous, which he became famous. He was the cantor of the largest synagogue in Europe, in Budapest, which Saul and I have visited, and lived there for many years. He didn't pay as much attention in the right way to his first family. He was more disciplinarian. With Saul, it was different altogether. Plus, he had a different mother. And this mother, rather than being the first mother who the father didn't get along with, was a woman that he really, really loved and was the most lovable person in the world. I couldn't have had a better mother-in-law, ever. My friends were jealous. They were really jealous. She never criticized me. And she taught me how to be a mother-in-law. So I have very good relations with my son-in-law and my daughter-in-law.
That's marvelous.
It is. No, really, she taught me how to do it. Fortunately, my parents loved Saul. And the real story about me meeting Saul was that my father set it up. My father had set me up on a date before. He was worried that I was going to be an old maid.
At 20?
No, this is when I was younger. So the date was very interesting. He was a good-looking guy. He was a Jewish guy, was fine with me. And he never called me back. And I had a good time, but the guy never called me back. So I said to my father, I'm going out with a lot of people. I don't need you to set me up with another blind date. Let me, meet somebody where we decide we want to date. So he said okay, but in the back of his mind, I guess he had this, and when Saul became unengaged and I was around, he suggested that Saul call me. Now, Saul had been told not to date anybody in Stanford because everybody was related. And he he just kept to the rules. I think he might have dated one person before me in Stanford. And then he just was going out with girls from Brooklyn, the Bronx, wherever. Here I lived only a block and a half from him, so it was easy. He was tired of driving.
Okay. So you eventually got married.
We got married.
And you brought your children up in Stanford,
We
right?
we had 3 children. I worked as a teacher before I had children, and then I was a stay-at-home mother, which is really what I liked doing. I called my children hand-raised. Like, they used to have a melon that they sold that was called a hand melon. And Mr. Hand was the man who developed this particular melon. It was so sweet. It was a cantaloupe type, but it was unusually sweet, and you never had a problem with it being hard as a rock. So that put it in my mind that I am hand-raising my children the way Mr. Hand raised his melons. And they turned out really good.
As you were raising them, what was the Jewish involvement of the family, or
Well,
this
was a problem. Saul, when I married him, belonged to a Agudas Shalom, and so I, of course, joined him. This was when Agudas Shalom was on Grove Street, and the first time I went to the high holiday services after we were married, I was upstairs behind. What do they call it? Mechitza. And the whole service was in Hebrew, which I didn't really know. My Hebrew education at Bethel was not great. I think Hebrew education's a lot better now. And I hated it. I hated everything about it. I hated the fact that I was separated, that I was going to a service that I didn't understand. And I don't know whether it was that year or the next year or whatever, but I eventually talked Saul into joining Bethel. And we went to services there for a number of years. My first child was probably would have been diagnosed now as hyperactive, and he used to get into a lot of trouble. And I didn't want to put him into public school, so I put him into bicultural school. That lasted until 3rd grade. This is important because Stephen had a great influence in our lives, as children do, if you pay attention. Eventually I took him out when I had my 3rd child, and it was just impossible to juggle all these children. They were quite a number of years apart in age. My 3rd child came when Stephen was 10. And we put him into public school at that point. He was going then to Temple Bethel Hebrew School. And because of bicultural's training, he had such knowledge that he was actually at 10 years old training bar mitzvah kids or helping them. He was very unhappy. He loved his teachers from bicultural. One of the problems with bicultural at that time was the class he was in, that grade, had only 3 boys. All the rest were girls. They had no physical ed program at all. They had one tree in the yard, and the boys would climb the tree. Their math and science program wasn't great. And this is the early years of bicultural. Of course, it's now become a wonderful school, but there were enough reasons for me. Plus, they demanded a lot of my time for fundraising to take him out of that school. So when Stephen said every time he ran into his bicultural teachers, they loved him. They didn't have trouble with him. One of them had been a tank commander in the Israeli army, and he adored her. I mean, she never had a problem with him. They were able to encourage him intellectually enough. Anyhow, he begged us to join a go to Sholom so he could be back with his bicultural teachers in their Hebrew school, because in those days bicultural was not only on the same grounds as a go to Sholom, but the Hebrew school was run by the same teachers that bicultural had. So I'm not much of a temple goer. It didn't matter where I didn't go. Saul used to go to services very more frequently, and so we went back to go to Shalom at that point and have been there ever since. Saul was almost president of Bethel before we left, and he eventually became president of Go to Shalom. Stephen was very happy. I felt my children's Hebrew education was very, very good. They went to Israel with Go to Shalom and really got a good feeling for Israel. I had my daughter bat mitzvahed in Israel because I didn't like the bat mitzvahs that they had for girls at a Go to Shalom. I still had my objections to the Orthodox, the separation of the men and the women. The services became far more English, though, and I like Rabbi Ehrenkrantz very much, a very charismatic person. So that's where we stayed, and that's the Hebrew education my children had. Most of my children went to public schools here in Stamford. Eventually, my son Stephen, once again, was getting bored and wild at school, and I put him into boarding school up at Loomis in Windsor, or South Windsor, Connecticut, which he said really saved his life in a lot of ways. He learned the discipline of learning, of studying, and he's now a tax litigator. My two children who went to public school got into Ivy League schools. Stephen got into Washington University in St. Louis, which he picked because it had such a large proportion of Jewish kids.
Okay.
But a lot of his friends weren't Jewish either.
Okay. So I think I don't have to ask you whether they were familiar with anti-Semitism, but let me ask it anyway.
I can't recall them
Okay.
ever coming home and saying that. My son Bob never only dated Christian girls. I knew he would never marry a Jewish girl. And lo and behold, well, he married a girl who converted, and
That says something positive.
very positive. And she's a terrific Jew, terrific. She's learning Hebrew now in her temple, and she's strictly Jewish. My daughter also married a Jewish person. My older son married a Jewish woman. They eventually divorced, but their children are grown and have tended to go towards Jewish men. So
Well,
who knows?
You never know.
You
but
never
it's-
know.
but
I don't know
that's
why I was the way
progress.
I was, where all my friends turned out to be in high school. This whole gang of mine, and a lot of them were before. This is the beatnik age, or before beatniks. Actually, my friends were beatniks. They were poets. They had beards. They were older. They just were very more interesting to me.
All right, let's talk more about you.
All right.
About your career choices and
Well,
what you did in the community.
My career
and so
choices were mind-numbing, sort of. Well, being a teacher, my mother insisted, and she was absolutely right, that I be able to earn my own living when I came out of college. I was an English major and a history minor, and I did education as a minor also. Skidmore only had one education person in there, and so I went to summer school to get enough credits. I got a job here in Stamford teaching at the old Clunan, which was behind the railroad station on Henry Street, and it was a very rough school. Murray Goldenberg was the principal, and he was tough as nails, and he really ruled the roost there. And consequently, it wasn't a wild school, though there were a lot of wild kids. I loved the children. I hated the discipline, and I loved teaching. I guess I was a born teacher the way my mother was a teacher also. She went through what was called then normal school in order to be a teacher. And she did teach also. So when I became pregnant with my first child, Stephen, I had to leave teaching. And I decided I really didn't want to go back. I enjoyed raising my children and living the life I was living, and we were fortunate that we were able to afford this. Saul became a partner before I became pregnant, which had a lot to do with me becoming pregnant. Then I was asked to work in a travel agency. Saul had some clients that were opening up a travel agency in Greenwich, and they asked Saul, they wanted to give Saul some shares in the business, and Saul said no, he didn't want that as a gift. He would buy these shares, so he bought, like 100 shares for $100 or so. But then when they were opening the office, they wanted any spouse, male or female, to come down and help rack the brochures and man the phones. Well, I went there and racked the brochures and looked around. I refused to answer the phone because I didn't know an answer if somebody asked me a question. So, but it seemed like a fun thing to do. So I went to travel agent school while I was working, and eventually, of course, was able to answer the phone. And then I worked for 20 years as a travel agent. We got into computers very early, back in the 80s, and I found my calling. I love computers. And I was one of the few people in the office that actually understood what I was doing with a computer. So I was the one that they would turn to for advice. I took training in New Jersey, and then I spent a week down in Texas learning another system. And I did a lot of traveling with Saul, without Saul, with my daughter Meredith, when she could get away and Saul couldn't get away. Saul and I traveled a lot. We were very fortunate. My mother, when I only had 2 children, unfortunately was widowed by that time. And I asked her if she would babysit my 2 boys, if I would have somebody there to do the lifting and the carrying. Not that the boys needed lifting and carrying, but do the housework and stuff like that. And Mother agreed. And the first place we went to was Israel, because my husband had been raised in Palestine, as it was called then. His father retired. As I mentioned before, he was 56 when Saul was born. He retired a couple of years after Saul was born, and he was an ardent Zionist. And in 1929 or 30, I'm not too sure which year, I think 29, he moved to Palestine and settled in Tel Aviv. They even named a street or section after Mr. Kwartin, as I call him, because I never met him. Unfortunately, he died before I met Saul. And then they moved to Haifa, and eventually they came back to the United States to keep their citizenship because they didn't want to become British citizens, because Palestine was under British mandate at that time. And the war broke out, or hostilities broke out in Europe, and they never went back. I mean, eventually they went as tourists or visiting relatives that were there. But Mr. Kwartin got out of Europe. His wife's family, which at that time consisted of her sister and her father, and every relative that he could possibly talk into leaving Europe and coming to as it was Palestine. So we've had relatives there, that are Saul's relatives there in Israel. Saul wanted to visit his last surviving aunt. He wanted to show me where he lived as a child, which now, instead of being a field of orange groves, was the middle of Tel Aviv. He showed me where he lived in Haifa, which was on Mount Carmel, overlooking the harbor and the Baha'i Temple gardens. It was beautiful, beautiful. Then that was the first time we traveled, and God bless my mother for doing it. And then we used to travel all the time. All the time.
And you went to Israel a number of times.
We got involved with the Zahal Shalom program. We were the first family, the first year that they had it, that brought in a disabled Israel veteran. The man they brought in did not speak any English, only Hebrew and Yiddish. My husband, fortunately, still had a little Hebrew left from his childhood, but his vocabulary was of a 10-year-old, and but his Yiddish was good. We became very close to this man, Levy, and he became like a brother to my husband, who really didn't have any living brothers. And after Rafi went back to Israel, he used to send a Hebrew newspaper to my husband every day. It was a newspaper for new immigrants, so that had the vowels in simple words. And every night, Saul would lie in bed and read the newspaper, and once or twice a month, he and Rafi would get on the phone and talk Hebrew to each other. And we would go every other year to visit Rafi and his wife and child, or Rafi and his wife would come here and visit us. And then eventually his son was studying here, and he came, and his girlfriend, and he got married. So and then we would visit them in Israel, their family. So we had another Israeli family there. Eventually, my daughter was engaged, and she was at her future in-laws' house, and they were reading the Jewish Voice, their version of it, down in Scarsdale. And he said, "Meredith, come look at this. Here's a picture of a family with your name." And here was a family that just came from Russia with 5 kids, and we're living in a hotel. Well, it so happened Saul and I were going to Israel again, and within a week, and we got some of our Israeli friends to call the hotel to find out if the Kwartins were still there. They weren't, but they left a telephone number. So we got on the phone, and our Israeli friend did the talking, just in case Saul's Hebrew wasn't good enough at that point. And it turned out these were second cousins. Oh. And it's a wonderful story. I love this story because I love history, as Saul did also. I could go on forever. When Saul's mother and father decided to go to Russia to visit his family, he was from Ukraine, but his family had moved up to Moscow and Leningrad. One of his sisters gave my mother-in-law a diamond pin. A very rough pin, but it must have been very valuable to them. It had a lot of diamonds, badly cut. I was just looking at it the other day. Anyhow, when we met the David Kwartins from Russia, David was able to tell us that he used to bike every day to visit this woman before the war, or during the war. She survived the war in Moscow. And it was, it just moved us so much. Since that time, my sister-in-law, Saul's sister, had gone to Russia and met a bunch of other Kwartins there. When Russia had opened up, they had let the Jews out. She found some that were heroes of Leningrad. They survived the siege of Leningrad, which, as you know, lasted 3 years. Anything that moved was eaten. He had medals. They didn't want to move to Israel. Some of them did move to U.S. Anyhow, one year we took my son Bob and his convert wife Nina, I have to emphasize that, to a family reunion in Israel. We took them to Israel. And we had a Russian-American dinner party at a very nice restaurant. And by that time there was a young man that looked very much like my son, as this David Kwartin looked just like Saul's father, which Saul did not look like. Saul looked just like his mother's family. But this man looked when we saw him, I said to Saul, "My God, that looks like pictures I've seen of your father." He said, "Yes, that's exactly, this is the short, stocky man with that sort of face." Anyhow, my son Bob, who's done the family history, brought along a disc and gave it to this young now Israeli Russian. And there were a whole bunch of new Kwartin immigrants, and this boy spoke Russian, Hebrew, and English, and Bobby was able to fill in the blanks of all these relatives way back when, which is wonderful. Just wonderful.
Wow, what a history story.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring you back to Stanford.
All right, back to Stanford. During my years of being a mom, I did volunteer work,
Right.
and almost all of it was with UJA, as it was then, and I used to be a fundraiser, and Saul was in politics. He was also very deep into UJA. He chaired most of the committees, working up to the highest level of fundraising with the big givers. Eventually Stanford decided to become a federation, and Saul was asked to be the first president. And he had to go around really and talk to every organization to convince them to come into federation, that it wasn't going to harm them. He had terrible fights. Everybody was worried about their own turf, that it was going to cut back on their own capital fundraising and this, that, and the other thing. People were going to give money only to federation. They wouldn't contribute any more to their synagogues, to bicultural, whatever. Anyhow, that got, Saul was he was the sort of person that everybody liked as soon as they saw him. There was something wonderful that came out of him. And people never got angry with him. And they listened finally. And it worked. Federation was formed. Saul was the first president. While he was president, a couple of women got together and came to him and said, "We'd like to reactivate Women's Division. What do you think?" And he said, "Go for it." So I was invited to the first meeting where they were trying to get women. At that point, when we did UJA, we were asking women for $5, or $10. I used to do this for my mother. My mother used to do a lot of fundraising for a Temple Bethel and also UJA. And every now and then she said, "Would you please call Mrs. So-and-so and ask her for some money? Maybe she'll listen to you." So I was used to fundraising from the beginning. So the first meeting we had, Marion Pinsley was one of the women, and Vivian, who I can't remember her last name, I'm so sorry, because she was a wonderful woman. Those were the two women that organized the Women's Division. They asked us if we could give $1 a day. And I agreed to do that, as did everybody around that table.
Wow.
And that was a big jump, because at that point, they were just asking men maybe in a married couple. Now they were asking women to be identified as people who controlled the money, which quite frankly, while you might be earning, Saul might be earning, I might not be earning. I'm the one that says, today we're going to eat meat and tomorrow we're going to eat vegetables because of the budget. Or, this year we can do this and we can't buy a new car until it's so many years old. Though in conjunction with my husband, but really I had control of what was going on in this house. So I could easily say that I was giving this sort of money. First of all, at the beginning, I had an uncle that used to give me $300 for my birthday every year, and I just turned it over to Federation.
Okay.
So that was cheating. But eventually, of course, I became a fundraiser within the organization, and eventually, of course, I was earning my own money again. But it didn't matter. Saul and I talked it over a lot, and he was willing to do anything. To him, it was wonderful that the women were organized separately, because we were getting people in that, say you were a widow, and some man's calling you to ask you for money because you're now the head of the household. This is a better idea.
Do you know what year that was?
No,
Okay.
I don't. It has to be within a year of the founding of Federation.
Okay.
I don't remember. I don't have the plaques on the wall like I used to have when Saul was alive.
I'm sure it's available, but
yes, Federation would have that noted. Anyhow, eventually, I became head of this division or that division, and eventually I became co-chairman. I just didn't want to take it on by myself, so I got one of my friends, Ann Weinberg, to co-chair with me for a couple of years. And it was fun, it was interesting, it was nerve-wracking, of course, because you set goals for yourself, you want to raise the money, it's for a good reason, and I just loved it. The other thing I got very involved in, and Saul also, but I started it, was the Judaic Studies program in Middle East Affairs. I had gone as part of Federation. We used to have one-day universities type of thing where you had a number of teachers and you could take different courses. And I went to one lecture that was on a book, and it happened to be a book I had read, so I wanted to hear what this teacher had to say, and it turned out to be Nahama Ashkenazi. I came home and I said, Saul, I have never, ever had such a good lecture in my life.
Wow.
I said, we've got to, this woman is fabulous. I don't know how it came about exactly, but one day in our living room here, we're sitting around with Nahama, with Tamar Baumgold, with Norma Mann, Hi Hoffman, and the head of the branch of UConn in Stanford.
Yakira Frank at that time?
Yakira Frank. And talking about having a program for adult education that wasn't about how to cook for Passover, and it wasn't teaching you Torah Talmud, but was a higher thing. It was a more intellectual, rather than just based on religion or just based on, the type of Jew that, eats bagels and lox on the holidays, or on the weekends. Right. So anyhow, we formed the Judaic program here. Matter of fact, I had a friend from Europe, one of my classmates from Europe, from Sweden, was here that day, or that week, staying with me, and years afterwards, she always remembered that day that we were sitting around working on this project. And that took quite a while to form and get the nucleus and get the ideas together. And I can't remember whether Tamar was our first president or chairman of the board, but Saul and I were on the board right from the get-go. We did have to do a lot of fundraising because while UConn allowed us to use their name, they refused to fund us. They had no money themselves at that time. So we had to raise money to pay for Nahama's salary. We used to have 2 sessions of 10 weeks each in the fall and the spring. We would get 40 people to talk about books, which we would read, and she would lecture, and it wasn't just a lecture, it was a give and take in the audience. She was fabulous. Eventually, thank goodness, after I don't know how many years, because I think we're almost hitting our 30th year now, UConn did take over, did bring us into their fold. Up to that point, we were called UConn at the Center because we had all our classes there. When Saul retired, he started going to classes with me because I used to come home every week raving about that book we read. It could have been Shakespeare, Chaucer, Scott Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton, or Jewish Hebrew writers. We just scanned the world. So Saul started coming to the classes, and he agreed with me that in all of his years of going to college, and he went to Dartmouth and Cornell Law School, he also had never met a professor of that quality. Unfortunately, once UConn took over, they were paying, who pays the piper calls the song. The program has disintegrated down to courses that you can take, or the lunch and learn, which gets a lot of people to come, but there's only 4 or 5 per season, rather than the 10 weeks where we would sit around and talk. And Nahama doesn't give that many of the lectures any longer, which I really regret. But she's gone on to bigger, better things, and you can't blame her.
Yeah, and she invites good people.
She invites very, very good people, and I have one of their lectures on my computer that I couldn't attend, and he kindly mailed it over to me, but when I saw it was 30 pages long, I haven't gotten around to reading it, and I refused to print it out.
Okay.
So that's the story of...
that's your community involvement.
That's
wow. So that's
But you have to understand that also during those same years, Saul was very involved in politics in Stanford. He ran for a number of offices. He won it sometimes, he didn't win it sometimes. Sometimes I voted against him. When he ran for the Board of Education, I said, Saul, I don't want you doing this. I said, you'll be out so many nights a week, and you'll be out for hours until late night, which is true of the Board of Education. I knew. And I don't know whether it really did. I threatened to vote against him. Anyhow, he didn't get on it, which was fine. But he was on the Board of Finance. He was on the zoning board. Also, he was on the original rent control committee that started right after urban renewal started. He was very involved with the urban renewal, both through his office and politically. So he really was deep in the community, and as I say, very well respected and loved. Unfortunately, he died 2 years ago, and that's it.
That's a really pretty impressive history. Are there any other activities you want to mention, just by the way?
Not really. I mean, I can't think of anything much, except for the last 12 years of Saul's life, which I didn't mention. He became paralyzed with a tumor on his spinal cord, a cancerous tumor, and ended up in a wheelchair for 12 years. In spite of that, he never, ever expressed anger, depression. He and I worked it out. It took a while, to work out how we were going to manage our lives together. But fortunately, we lived in a ranch house, so we didn't have any stairs. We didn't have to create any bedroom space in a living room. But our children did create spaces for us. And we lived a very full life. We did everything we could. We went to lectures, we went to concerts, we went to restaurants. We just couldn't get into people's houses.
You learned how to drive a truck.
A mobility van, we call that. It's really just
Okay.
just a minivan that's converted into a one with a ramp that will come down. The middle seats are taken out, and the passenger seat can be taken out, and they put in these big, heavy-duty clip-ons to hold the wheelchair in place, so that if I brake fast, he doesn't go through the window or out the back door.
Okay, let me ask you if you want to, and I want to reflect a little on the characteristics of the parts of the Jewish community you observed, if you'd like to make any reflections or comments on that.
In what way?
Any way that anything you haven't
Well,
covered
I've
or that
become
you'd like to think about?
I've become much more friendly with Jewish people. Though it turns out that when I go to the Tully gym, and I go to water aerobic classes, and guess what? Every one of the friends I've made there, most of them aren't Jewish.
Okay, so this is different from...
No, I mean, this is me. It doesn't
Okay.
matter to me whether a person is Jewish or not. A couple of the friends I've made have been Jewish, but the ones that have been dearest to me have been non-Jewish, which is really strange. Most of my friends are Jewish. I have a whole gang of friends that I see at least monthly, if not more often. We go out for lunch together.
Okay, this is...
I don't know what to say. After being chairman of Federation, Women's Division, I had learned from past experience that the best thing I could do for the incoming chairman was to step way back, way back, and almost disappear into the woodwork,
Okay.
rather than offering her any suggestions. Some former presidents used to have problems with then the lack of power, and I didn't have any problems giving up power. Saul, when he was no longer president of the Shul, some of the next couple of presidents would call him all the time for advice, which he freely gave. But that things go along. I became a temple person when my mother-in-law died, whom as I said before, I loved dearly. A wonderful, wonderful woman. I then started going to services every week. I had my daughter with me to sit with. I mean, besides the people that I met at the Shul, whom I really didn't make any friends with for some reason. So I went to Shul almost every week, and that lasted for quite a number of years, and then I stopped. And I just stopped.
Now, you mentioned that you would like to have a mezuzah videotaped.
A mezuzah.
That's what you wrote.
Oh yes, I
You
can
wanted
get that off the
something
wall. Yes.
That Julie would...
I forgot about that one.
See, that's why you filled this out in advance.
This mezuzah was given to me after I was no longer chairman of the Women's Division, and it's in honor of being the chairman. And I just think it's one of the more beautiful things to give. And I have it on my front door. Debbie, first of all, which I didn't realize, there was a big split between the conservative and the Orthodox in Stanford, which I was never really aware of until one time I was having dinner with a whole bunch of people, one of whom was Debbie's brother-in-law, something Klein. And I said, gee, you know, I can't remember you from high school or anything like that, though I knew his sister, I knew his wife, who was Debbie's younger sister. And he said, oh, that's because you were rich and you belonged to Temple Bethel, and we belonged to Agudah Shalom. And, you know, it made me think, was he right in saying that? I mean, I was friends with a number of people who were at Agudah, but my closer friends were from Temple Bethel, that's true. My Jewish friends. Why not? Why wouldn't it? But there was a schism there. Maybe there still is, I don't know.
I'm not an expert on that, so
You know,
I came to Stanford too late to be an expert on that.
well, it's, it made me think a lot.
Where was Temple Sinai in your vision?
Well, when I was in my teenage years, I was very close to my parents' neighbors. I used to babysit for them. And Bernice and George Karp. And George is dead now, unfortunately, and Bernice remarried somebody here in Stanford whose name I can't remember, and they moved out. But anyhow, she says, we're joining the Reformed Temple. I said, huh? What Reformed Temple? What are you talking about? And that's Temple Sinai that was formed. And matter of fact, I'm considering going to Temple Sinai. I'm definitely leaving Agudah Shalom. Now that Saul's not there, he used to go every single Saturday until he was disabled. And then it was really a hassle to get him up early enough to go to services every Saturday. When we had to get him up and out, it meant getting up between 5:30 and 6 in order to get out of the house by 8 o'clock or so. And which we did for many years because he had meetings. He was working, he was on the board of People's Bank, and they had weekly meetings. So we used to have to go up to Bridgeport for a 9 o'clock meeting. And we really had it down to a science to get him up, showered, dressed, fed, and out the house.
Okay.
So he stopped going to shul except for high holidays, where he still did. And recently, not too long ago, Rabbi Cohn arranged for a bima to be brought up to the level where Saul could actually ride his wheelchair, so he could have an aliyah, which I thought was lovely. And he thought it was lovely also.